This film has been prepared for you, the Mercury distributors and dealers, to give you the facts. The next time a prospective buyer asks you, why should I buy a Mercury, you can tell him not only what a Mercury can do that competitive motors cannot, but also the reasons why. The turnoff for Camp Mac, secluded fishing camp on the famous Kissimmee River leading into Lake Kissimmee, is not far from the Bach Singing Tower at Lake Wales, Florida. This remote water was selected for an interesting outboard motor test that had never been attempted before. Three almost identical boats and three different motors were chosen for the test. Their modern outlines are in sharp contrast to the age-old Spanish moss and oak trees as the group arrives at Camp Mac. Only a relatively few fishermen come here for the big-mouth black bass. Thus, its remote location makes the site ideal to carry out the tests with some secrecy and unhampered by other boats. The motors are the new Mercury 60-horsepower Mark 75 and the 35-horsepower Model J, as we will call it, and the 35-horsepower Model E, all 1957 motors. The 35-horsepower twins are, of course, made by the same company and are identical engines, although they have different names. At Camp Mac, launching is an easy matter. Cars can back down to the water's edge, and the gentle slope enables fast, efficient launching without getting wet feet. Once in the boat, the Mercury driver merely presses the thumb button starter on the single lever control of the new Mark 75, and the powerful motor backs easily off the trailer. The test driver pushes the control lever forward, presses the thumb button again, and the motor powers the boat forward. The boat is waterborne and underway in less than 1 minute. Launching of the other two boats also is relatively simple, except for the fact that these two motors are not equipped with electric starters and generators as standard equipment. Therefore, it's necessary to start them manually, which is not always successful on the first attempt. After all the boats have been started, the trio leave in formation for the special area selected as the testing grounds. As you can see, the three boats are the same size in order that any differences in test results will be due to differences in the motors only. As one indication, you will see the similarity in planing qualities of the three fiberglass runabouts as the test proceeds. The three test drivers are of equal experience. After trailing the camera boat for several miles, the Mercury test driver with 60 horsepower becomes impatient. Watch as the Mercury spurts ahead. He gracefully crosses the wake and is followed by his slower companions who are pushing their boats to the limit. Actually, the boat with the Mercury is heavier than the other two boats in order to make sure that the test is as equal as possible. The Kissimmee River runs into Lake Kissimmee, one of the largest inland lakes in Florida, several miles downstream from Camp Mac. What is the special area the boats are heading for? It's one that's completely covered by a blanket of hyacinth, sawgrass, small trees, stumps, roots, and decaying vegetation. An area that's never before been traveled by outboards, inboards, or even airboats. A starter flag sends the three test boats into probably the most startling test of modern outboard performance in the past several years. The obstructions faced by the underwater units of outboard motors in areas like this of heavy water vegetation have always kept boats out. The narrow channel goes only a little way, and then, plunging into the solid blanket of hyacinths, go the boats. But the Model J motor can't do it. And there goes the Model E out, kicking up a splatter of mud. But the Mercury is in no trouble at all. It moves forward almost as if there were no hyacinths and sawgrass and stumps and small trees. Breaking new trails, the Mercury goes at will wherever the driver feels like going and where an outboard has never traveled before. Of course, no inboard would ever dare venture into this, and no airboat has been seen here. The water below the covering blanket is actually some 3 to 4 feet deep, but the surface and underwater growth is so thick that in most parts of the area it's hard to tell there is any water at all. Sometimes the growth is so high and dense that the boat can hardly be seen as it slices through the pathless, covered water. This kind of water area is not an extreme. It is often found in lakes and streams across the country. The patches of growth, of course, are not always hyacinth. They may be lily pads, reeds, weeds, or any number of different types of vegetation. Stretches of the vegetation often cut off one piece of good fishing and boating water from another. Sometimes the best fishing is back in a small, clear area, entirely surrounded by thick lily pads. From the time of the first outboard in 1905, motorboats have not been able to reach them. With the demonstration of the Mercury here, large new areas of fishing and boating area are now open to outboards. People seeing these motion pictures or trying the test with the Mark 75 themselves will, of course, be amazed. Actually, there is no dark secret or complicated device that makes this possible. There are some simple explanations as to why the Mercury Mark 75 can do it, while the other motors have some problems. Basically, the answer is in the engineering and design of the motor, which will be seen later, and the motor's tremendous reserve power. Let's go back now to the 35-horsepower twins and see what has happened to the other two boats while the Mercury has cavorted freely where outboards have never dared to pass. The Model J motor is right where it stopped originally. Here is what played an underwater trick on the J. The hyacinth leaves and stems quickly clogged up the lower unit completely. There is no solution for the test driver except to pull up the motor and remove the mess. Trying to pull up the big Model E outboard is tough. For the driver, it's as slippery as a watermelon covered with dew, what with no handles for lifting. Finally, with much straining, he gets it up far enough to begin picking off the weeds and stems, which stopped him within a few feet of the Model J right after entering the hyacinth bed. This doesn't make for the happy family boating about which the E firm advertises, and it doesn't fit the sweetest running motor ever picture that's being advertised to the public by the makers of the J. All set, but with fingers crossed, the two drivers start out again. But the Model J on the left is in trouble right away. Watch it begin to steam as the engine has to object to the rough going. 10 seconds after starting, the Model E has to give up too, with a few defiant jerks and jumps as the weeds clog up its propeller again. Back in the same fix they were in, it's going to mean lifting up those motors again, unclogging them, and trying to continue on as best they can. The Mercury driver finally comes back to see what's happening. What's the matter, boys? Having trouble? You bet they're having trouble. The Mercury offers assistance. He'll go back for a tow rope. Just to add insult to injury, he backs up in the hyacinth. Then, moving the throttle forward, he's off to get the tow line. The Mercury takes the long way round to get the tow rope. This is too much fun to have to quit so soon. The camera, shooting right over the bow, gives you an idea of the height and size of the 1-inch thick brush that the Mercury is negotiating with ease. As you note, the driver sometimes has the throttle wide open, other times throttles back a little. The boat almost runs on top of the hyacinths, as it planes nicely with the Mark 75. The other two boats, being almost identical, would of course plane equally well if their motors could handle the underwater growth and obstructions. The two drivers with their 35-horsepower motors are unclogged and ready to try again. They start hopefully but hopelessly, as they both bog down for the third time. Discouraging, to say the least, as far as showing that these motors can do anything. Just how thick the hyacinths are is shown in this close-up view as the bow of the boat pushes slowly through the bed. The water below is completely out of sight. Here is a close-up of one of the hyacinth plants, showing the matted stems and tentacles that extend down into the water below the surface to clog an outboard motor. The Mercury, by now far away from the other two boats, has picked up a tow line and begins to head back to help. If you've been wondering how the camera boat keeps from being bogged down, it's powered by a dual installation of the 60-horsepower Mark 75s. The Mark 75 is the first 6-cylinder motor ever engineered by the industry, and therefore is another Mercury first. The 6-cylinder inline engine, firing every 60 degrees of crankshaft rotation, is as smooth as a V-12 aircraft engine. Gas consumption, contrary to what you might think, is very favorable. In fact, the Mark 75 at comparative cruising speeds uses less gasoline than any competitive two-cylinder engines now being produced by the industry. The Mark 75 is an electric starting motor with a revolutionary single-lever remote control unit which gives the driver one-hand control of forward, neutral, reverse, throttle, and starting. Aside from its tremendous power and underwater design, one contributing reason why the Mercury Mark 75 is able to skim through the hyacinths is its unique non-clogging water pump system. The propeller passes water over the water intake in such fashion as to make it self-cleaning. On other outboards, the propeller pushes not only the water but also the weeds into the intake, causing the clogging. The drivers of the two stalled motors have given up trying to run the motors and wait patiently for help. The Mercury drives up easily, stops, and passes them the tow line. The Mercury not only tows one boat, it tows both boats out of the area, which has meant only trouble to the Model J and the Model E. For the Mark 75, even the towing is no trouble or strain. From the standpoint of the drivers of the large twin outboards, the day has been a complete loss. But from the standpoint of the test, the objectives have been accomplished. A really modern outboard can run under such conditions. Older outboards, at least older in the sense of not keeping up in engineering development, cannot. Let's take a close look at just why the other two motors could not handle any underwater weeds. The stems and weeds caught on the projecting football-like gear case, wrapping around and very quickly stopping the propeller of Model E. And it doesn't take many weeds to do this, obviously. The Model J has the same protruding football gear case to catch and hold the weeds. Also, remember the steaming when the motor stopped? That happened when those same weeds plugged up the water pump intake. The Mercury Mark 75 does not have the protruding gear case. There is just no way for the weeds to catch and clog up the propeller. What do these tests prove, then? They show what better engineering, better design, and more available power can mean. True, you do not run in this kind of water every day, but the fact that you can ensures easy running under ordinary conditions. It gives you the reserve and safety that spells the difference between the Mercury and an ordinary outboard motor.